I received an email from my US-based broker, actually, and it said if I don't log into my account and say that I'm still alive or something like that, my account will be escheated by the state of Connecticut. And I thought it was a spam email because it didn't make any sense to me. I opened the account through Hong Kong. I'm a German citizen and I have nothing to do with Connecticut. I also never been in Connecticut. And so why would the state of Connecticut, nationalize or take all of my assets from me? And as I was looking at the email, I realized that there was actually the last 4 digits of my account, and it was a genuine email, really coming from that broker. It was not a spam email. And so I logged in, and I actually called the broker and said, what is going on? They said, well, we are essentially based in Connecticut, and the state of Connecticut has a law that if an account is not being logged into or somehow else transacted with within a certain number of years, then the state of Connecticut will just take all of those assets. And I found that something that's really scary. It's one thing which sort of made me withdraw really most of my funds from most financial institutions and reinforce this idea to go into alternative assets because not looking at an account should not cause it to disappear in thin air, which is essentially what I was being told. Our financial system is is controlled by the United States because the US essentially controls the SWIFT wiring system, which is how wires are transferred from one bank to another bank. And so that gives them an enormous amount of power. As long as that power is not being abused, it's worked quite well. The US has followed a policy of talk softly and carry a big stick. And the big stick was a big military, but it was also the control of the SWIFT wiring system. The problem is that nowadays the United States is yelling and really forcing countries to do things against their will oftentimes, and using that stick, that SWIFT banking wire threat to make countries do things, which then creates resentments. And in the banks, the financial institutions, the countries, where these things are being pushed through. An example, for example, recent one is Carrie Lam in Hong Kong. Carrie Lam is essentially the president equivalent of Hong Kong. And Carrie Lam was put on a sanction list by the US because of the way she runs Hong Kong. And whether that's justified or not, that's a different discussion. But the point is that Hong Kong banks had to close the bank account of the president, of the prime minister equivalent, and because a foreign power says so. And that creates a lot of resentment because people in a country, rightfully I think, say that we should have control over what our bank do. And the reality is they don't, because they're controlled by the United States. The European Union, is facing a similar issue. There was Germany and Russia are building a gas pipeline, which the United States does not think is in the interest of the United States because they prefer to sell gas from the United States instead of Europe buying it from Russia. And so some of the companies which built the pipeline essentially were threatened to have put sanctions into them, in which case no bank will be allowed to work with these entities, including German banks, because the United States will then threaten that bank, if you work with the company building that, we are going to look at whether we're still going to allow you to do SWIFT wires and or make you pay billions in fees. And so banks will always do whatever the United States tells them to do because of this reason. And so suddenly European foreign policy and energy security is being determined by the United States. The reason why the United States is so powerful in this again is they put sanctions in some of the companies that are building Nord Stream, which in turn caused these companies to abandon the project and delay it. And again, that created a lot of misgivings towards the US dollars, the SWIFT system, and how this is being abused. And I think these are two good examples of why countries in the world are wanting to move to a new financial system that is not based on the SWIFT system. In a world where everybody looks at the United States and the US dollar, and where the US dollar essentially is willing to print as much money as it takes, it's getting quite hard to have traditional financial crisis, because in a normal system you have a boom and you have a bust. And the bust is very important because it clears the economy from companies that are not doing well. And people compare it like a forest fire, which essentially allows for new growth to come up. If we constantly print so much money, we bail out people, we create a weaker and weaker economy. And over time, we create a weaker and weaker reserve currency because we are printing so much money. And when so much money is being issued, at some point people might start doubting the value of that money, because in 2021, it's my understanding the United States will have a deficit of 2.8 trillion US dollars. It's never been a country which had so much debt, in the history of the world. And so where are we going with that? Can we really keep on accelerating that growth? What if next year we're going to print $5 trillion? That's the beginning of hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is essentially the end of a currency. And so I think that will be my biggest fear of, what's coming next. And this will be a really, really big systemic crisis, because the whole world now still runs around the US dollar. And if you have a trust issue in the United States dollar, we will see some major disruptions. Will the US nationalize gold? I think the chance is that they will. And if you look back at 1933, the US nationalized gold, that was the 5th of April, through an executive order. It was not a law, it was not passed by Congress. It was the president who did this, and within 2 weeks or so, everybody had to turn in their gold. Otherwise, gold would be treated like heroin is treated today. You can go to prison for 10 years for having gold. So that was a very drastic thing. And the reason it was done back then was because the government needed to print more money. And the US dollar was backed by gold back then. And you could actually redeem your US dollar into gold. And redemption is always the most important test, because as long as you can redeem, you put a limit on how much currency can be created. So back then, they wanted to print more money. They still wanted to have the US dollar be backed by gold. So how do we do it? Well, we just make it illegal for people to own gold. That seems like an easy thing. You ask for redemption, we arrest you. And it worked because the Hoover Dam and so on, it was built through that. And then by 1971, the system didn't work anymore because countries could still redeem gold. And countries like France and Switzerland and others, started saying, hey, here are your dollars, give me your money because you're printing too much money. And that's when the US went off the gold standard in 71. But why would they do it today? Because obviously they're printing money out of the wazoo nowadays, right? The problem at some point comes back to what I mentioned earlier, trust. If people no longer trust that currency, then you essentially lose all of your power, because as a government, how do you pay your police? How do you pay your government employees, your army? How's everything going to run, right? So a valid currency is fundamentally important for a government. And if that is ever put into doubt, there's no choice but to make a new currency. And that new currency is going to be based by something people can trust again. And if we look at examples throughout history, whether it's Weimar Republic or other examples, at the end, it always ends up being gold again, and or silver. I think that gold will definitely again play an important role in whatever new currency is going to be created in order to reestablish that trust. And so if we go from the promise that there will be a currency crisis and there might be a need for that new currency, which history tells us there will be, then we can expect to have a nationalization again in the United States. I was in the midst of the 2008 financial crisis from a trading room, essentially, in a major bank. And that really scared me, seeing how fragile the system is. And that's why we started Silver Bullion. We went into precious metals, and we looked at how to securely store precious metals. And so if that question is posed to me, my first answer will be yes. But as I went through the process of figuring out how to secure wealth, it took me a couple of years to realize that actually the answer is no. The reason the answer is no is that you have to understand the concept of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is essentially, where do the laws of a certain country apply? So if you take a country like Austria, for example, Austrian law typically just applies in Austria. But if you take the United States, the United States has much more power. If the United States tells a French bank, which has no other subsidiaries in the US, to jump, the French bank is going to jump. Just like BNP Paribas did when they were told that you have to pay a huge fine because you traded with Cuba, which the French government didn't have a problem with. So because of this, you have to look at, and if you're worried that the United States might nationalize gold, you have to look at who has to follow US law if there is such a law, if such an executive order happens. And it turns out that every bank, every Western bank, is going to have to follow that law. And every company which has, considerable exposure to the United States in some way is going to have to follow that as well. And so when it came down to reading the small print of most storage contracts, it might, especially when it comes directly to a vault, you will find a section which is the force majeure clause of that contract, which essentially states that if any gold or other precious metals is going to be nationalized, confiscated, escheated, or otherwise seized by any foreign government, you have to identify the vault operator. And so I was shocked when I first read this, because I wanted to store my gold in Singapore. And yet I had to sign a contract saying that any government can take my gold and there's nothing I can do about it. That was essentially one of the major reasons why we ended up creating our own vault and make sure that we don't have the any clause. We do have a clause that says that we are subject to Singapore jurisdiction. We have to do what Singapore says, but we don't have to do what other countries have to say. And that's essentially why taking your gold offshore to some jurisdiction is not enough. Where it is located matters a lot less than the jurisdictional exposure that that company has and the small print in the contract that you are signing, or that your middleman between you and the vault is signing on your behalf. Silver Bullion itself is providing liquidity for gold and silver, but we have a subsidiary, which is a safe house, which is essentially our vault operator. And we are different in the sense that typically in this industry, you are dealing with a bank, a bullion dealer, or some other wealth manager, who then deals with you and essentially outsources storage of physical, if there is physical, to a third-party vault. And that's pretty much how the business evolved. We've gone a different route because of any government jurisdictional issue, and we built our own vault. And we basically integrated Silver Bullion, the vaulting company, and recently we have bought our own 180,000 square foot building, which is basically housing all of this. And the combination of this essentially means that we are a single counterparty. When you're dealing with us, there's no middleman, there's no complex jurisdictional sort of exposure, because we're all doing it in-house, and our only material exposure is to Singapore. So you're dealing with a single country jurisdiction, and you're dealing with a single counterparty. We feel that we are essentially providing that secure nest egg, that part of your wealth which is going to be there no matter what happens. And there are 4 key things that we do which are very unusual for the industry. The first thing is that we ensure that the bullion is your property. And the way we do it is everything is tracked by individual serial number, and we sell that gold bar or that silver bar to you through an invoice. And it's important because an invoice is a legal document which essentially removes that asset from our balance sheet and makes it legally yours. Then secondly, insurance. We have one of the best insurances in the world. We essentially insure not just for outside theft, but we're also insuring for infidelity, which essentially covers us stealing it and running away with it. And most importantly, we cover mysterious disappearance. And mysterious disappearance is a coverage which is very difficult to get, and it covers everything that is otherwise not included, that cannot be explained. So if we have a mistake or something cannot be explained, the insurance will pay regardless. And so we essentially are able to protect our customers with this. And then something else that's unique about us is we actually have the capacity of testing bullion, and we do test all bullion that's transferred in from other customers or other vaults. When it comes from refineries directly, we'll just do some sample testing. But essentially, this testing method guarantees that the bullion, whether it's gold, silver, platinum, nickel, is actually tested and matches the specifications. And we do this through a testing system which we call DUX. It involves ultrasound, X-ray spectrography, electrical conductivity, magnetism, density. These are 5 tests we do. We'll do 2 or 3 of these in a way that essentially ensures that, and we can guarantee it. So if ever there's an issue with that gold or silver, we will replace it. And that's something that's not done in the industry. So, but we felt that it's important. And then the last point of these 4 is the Singapore-only jurisdiction, meaning that we will only have to follow Singapore government laws. If a foreign country is having some claim against that bullion, we will essentially ask that country to go to a Singapore court and figure it out in the Singapore jurisdictional sort of context. And I think that's something that very few companies are able to do, because most companies in this business are either globally or otherwise, have a very complicated jurisdictional exposure, and so they cannot afford to do it the way we do it. Gold confiscation in Singapore, which will be started because the government needs money and people don't trust the currency, for example, that's an extremely unlikely possibility, because Singapore is a very rich country. It's one of the few countries which usually has budget surpluses. It does not have many unfunded liabilities because we have a self-funding retirement system and Medicare system. And the whole advantage, or the whole reason Singapore became so rich in the first place, is essentially because of trust that Singapore developed over the last 50, 60 years with entrepreneurs, with investors, with foreigners coming here and putting their companies in Singapore. And the government is very aware of that you can never do something which in some way endangers the trust that people have in the government. And so essentially this government doesn't have a reason to nationalize, because they have plenty of money. And if they were to do something like this, they're essentially committing economic suicide. So I think of all the countries out there, Singapore will probably be the last country where gold nationalization would be initiated by the government. Silver Bullion has from the beginning had this philosophy of essentially keeping its funds within the company in order to grow and become stronger, and reinvest and buy more gold and silver. And over the years, we have accumulated about 750,000 ounces of silver that we have in inventory, debt-free, and about 3,500 ounces of gold, also debt-free. And so we have a very comfortable cushion when it comes to net assets. We have not had debts until we purchased our new 180,000 square foot building, and we paid 40% of that in cash. So we have a 60% loan, which is financed at 1.5%, against this property. We're also having enough storage income that can easily pay for the whole company. So even if we had zero sales, we will still make a profit. And so because of this, we are sort of off the scale when it comes to financial security or as a counterparty. We can essentially operate indefinitely, even if we don't have any sales. And I always felt that it was very important because I believe Singapore, is the best jurisdiction for you to store gold and silver or other valuable assets. And we didn't want to be the weak spot because you have to store it with somebody, and that counterparty you choose has to be strong. And part of that is being very transparent. The other part is to, be a solid counterparty, and we've been striving very hard to be that. Not because the most efficient thing to do, but because we think it's the right thing to do. To build something that lasts, the best way I found is to provide a lot of transparency on it. Because if you start with a good system and it's a black box where outsiders cannot really look into it, over time, maybe not the first year, but maybe after a decade or 2 decades, that system is probably going to atrophy, and maybe people are not going to pay as much attention whether the bar is really there or it's put in the right place and so on. But if you build a system which is so transparent that anybody can see it, that any small errors that might occur in terms of the bar being put in the wrong location or something like this, then it will keep everybody on their toes. And it will essentially ensure that people will put effort into making sure everything is as clean as possible. It also means that all of the clients or outsiders can essentially see and become auditors of the system. Another thing that we do at Silver Bullion, which is, I would say, unusual maybe, is that we are very flat sort of organization. So I always want to make sure that the company can run just fine if I'm not here. And, I think I very much achieved it because I can disappear for a month and, everything works just fine. Because operationally, everybody sort of has their own little authority. And I don't really need to be there as much. We are a very flat sort of organization, and we follow a management system which is somewhat follows that holacracy concept. Holacracy is something which was also developed by a software engineer, which is maybe why I like it. But it essentially says that if you have a role which is responsible for a certain aspect of the company, you also have the authority. You don't need to go and get permission from somebody else to do something because we trust you to make the best decision. And within a few constraints which are normally built into the software of the system itself, which we built in the first place. So that combination of trusting our employees and our partners in the company to basically do the best as they see fit makes for a company which I think is trustable and is quick to sort of respond to changes and to issues. And you also create a situation where things don't bottleneck with one person. And in order to encourage this even further, most of our employees also have some form of share ownership in the company. And most people, when they have shares in the company, they feel a greater sense of ownership, literally, which then again reinforces this philosophy. And there are a lot of things that are happening in the company where I'm not even involved. SBTV is a good example. There was a brainchild of Vincent and Patrick, which came up with this, and it's all they're doing. I'm sort of saying reaping the benefits from it, sitting in this interview here. So and I think it's a really good way for company to run and to remain stable over a long period of time. What I would say is don't delay into understanding some of these things and preparing for it. Whether you choose us or you choose somebody else, our motto has always been to build trust with the customer, and sales and so on is a secondary thing, which people might choose us, but they might choose somebody else. But buying a bit of gold or a bit of silver is something that has served people very well in similar times of history. And I mean similar time of history, we are looking at, say, 1920s Germany. When hyperinflation came, people who bought gold and silver, they had something when things ended up becoming really bad. And so should you.